if you don't speak up, right? If something is not right and you don't speak up, then you're never going to stand out.
Hey, Duncan.
Hey, how are you?
Fantastic. Let me just get the audio going through the correct output here.
Sure.
I had to get new AirPods because the batteries don't last through an episode anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's not good.
For about a year, they worked, right? And I use
Yeah.
them a lot. I use them when I run in the morning, and then I use them when we record the podcast. But then, about 6 weeks ago, just at 45 minutes into the podcast, it just cut out. And tried it again because I was starting with 100% battery charge. I was like, I guess the batteries just, they wear out like anything, right? With the iPhones, with any type of battery, it's going to wear out.
Yeah, but you wouldn't expect it to be 12 months. I mean, 12 months is a bit short. Actually, so yesterday, one of my headphones actually died. And this is Audio-Technica. I had it for 11 years. 11 years. So, that is, a decent time to work for a pair of headphones. But a year is a bit short, I would say.
I know. I thought they were I was just stalking you on Twitter. I thought they were your daughter's headphones.
Yeah, well, they used to be mine. So I bought them 11 years
Okay.
ago to use them on flights. But I switched over to the Bose in-ear, and I have a pair of Sony as well, the noise canceling. Those are pretty decent. So I have like 4 or 5 different headsets. But I actually ended up giving these to my daughter because she had a couple of JBL headphones, actually 2 pairs that already broke in the past 12 months. So, that's the problem with kids these days. They don't see the value in stuff, and they don't realize how fragile, some of these newer technologies are, right? So.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. I love the phrase "the kids these days" because it makes us feel old.
Well, I'm halfway 40, so I am pretty old. That's what my kids would say.
Yeah, I've got 2 little ones too, both about 3 and 1.5. So I'm just getting started with the kids.
Yeah, I mean, mine are 18 and 15, so yeah, that makes you feel really old. I can tell you that.
So I wanted to give you a shout out because I saw that you were doing this crowdfunding campaign for your friend that lost their house in a fire.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you know, there were wildfires in California not too long ago, and he lives near Santa Cruz in a small town. Unfortunately, at some point during the week, they were evacuated out of the house around 3 at midnight. So basically, they were told, grab anything you can grab and get out as fast as possible because the fire is coming close. It's heading towards this direction, and he actually lives on a mountain. So it's they needed to get out very quick because there's only one road, up and one road down. So they got out, fortunately, safe. They managed to grab a couple of things, but after about a week or so, they found out that the whole house is gone. They took some pictures. And I've been there a couple of times. I've stayed at his home a couple of times, and it's only ashes. That's the only thing that is left. It was ridiculous. I dropped him a couple of phone calls, and it's just very sad to see what has happened. Everything is gone. I mean, it's not just the clothes and your books and stuff like that, but it's also all of the memories, pictures, all other kinds of memorabilia that they had from the family or whatever it ended up being, right? So it's all gone. There's nothing left.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting experience because like I'll still drive by the home where I grew up in, right? So just the symbolic aspect of that being your home, your place on this planet, that can just be, very difficult. So we'll put a link we'll put a link in the show notes to their, I think it's like a GoFundMe type crowdfunding campaign so that people can check that out if they want. But this isn't your only like giving back type of thing that you've done. I also saw that you did this cool project that I really liked where you bought Chromebooks for orphanages. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, actually, it's been pretty long. it's a long time ago. I was part of a group of people that for VMware actually went to Vietnam to help out this organization setting up these computer labs for orphanages. So back then we actually went to Vietnam itself, and we set up these computer labs, but they weren't using Chromebooks just yet. They were using regular laptops and you know they had just regular Wi-Fi and stuff like that. But what they quickly found out after we visited and we created some content as well for them to deliver is that a lot of the Chromebooks or a lot of the technology that they were using back then, the regular laptops, were too expensive, but they also weren't very resilient, so they would break pretty fast. And what they noticed is they started testing with some of the Chromebooks that the Chromebook technology is actually geared towards kids and the way kids handle these types of things, and especially in environments like Vietnam, as you can imagine, it's pretty humid, it's pretty warm. There's multiple classes using these laptops, and they switched over to those Chromebooks. And not too long ago, I was actually in contact with them, and they mentioned to me that they were planning on refreshing some of these lab environments. And because I'd been with the company for 12 years, VMware gave me about $3,000 to donate to charity. So I could have picked any charity. But I recall the conversation that I had with these guys. So I emailed them again, and I said, what would a average environment cost you? What would a classroom setup cost you? And they said, well, the classroom would be about, roughly $3,000, give or take. Could be 3,000, could be 3,600, depending on when they would buy these Chromebooks. So I figured, I'm going to do some form of crowdfunding campaign to see if other people want to chip in, and maybe we get an additional couple of hundred of dollars, and they would be able to replace some of the Wi-Fi routers that they have, or 4G routers, and whatever it is, right? So a couple of $100 that can go a long way in a country like Vietnam. I was very fortunate to have a great response to that crowdfunding campaign, because an additional $7,000 came in. So we raised, including my contribution from VMware, and then a personal donation. It was slightly over $10,000, which allows these guys to actually buy 3 full classroom setups, and they probably have some spare change left. We're talking about 45 Chromebooks roughly. And the great thing about this is, because I visited this place myself, and I've seen the people from Kidspire actually giving these classes to these kids, these orphans in Vietnam. But what struck me the most is when we were there and they were teaching these kids, right? If you go to any school in the US or in Europe, wherever you end up being, right, you never see kids fairly eager, or even happy to walk into a classroom. Maybe now after COVID, right, then they can go back to school. But these kids, every single day, they came from school, and then they had their computer classes in the orphanage itself. And they were jumping up and down. They were waiting in line just to get in, to get a seat at the table, to start, learning new technology. And the other thing, of course, is, at that point in time, they were also connected to the internet. So they could go to Facebook, they could go to Instagram, they could, chat to some of their friends on the other side of the country, maybe the other side of the world. The world opened up for these kids, and the joy on their faces is something that I will, never forget. And that's one of the reasons I set up this fundraising campaign, because these guys do great work, and I know it means a lot for these kids as well.
So is Kidspire, is that like the parent organization?
Yeah, Kidspire is the parent organization. They used to do 2 things. Basically, they would help with adoption for orphans from Vietnam to the US specifically. But lately, their focus has been more around enabling the kids in Vietnam, and which I think probably scales better, and it allows, or it enables probably more kids to have a better chance of being successful in life. A lot of these kids will go to school, but they typically stay in and they may, if they're lucky, they get adopted by a decent family. But a lot of them actually end up staying in the orphanage until they're old enough, to start living on their own. But the problem, of course, is when you only have a certain amount of education, and you don't have the right skill set, it's very difficult to get a decent job. And they typically would start with probably being 10 steps behind the average person in Vietnam. And the average person in Vietnam, of course, isn't as wealthy or rich or lucky as we are, unfortunately. So this program that KidSpy has started is huge for these kids. I mean, they are teaching these kids to do math and counting in binary and all of these different types of things. And whether they are building a website or they're learning how to count, it's they enjoy every single thing, and that was the amazing thing to see for me.
Yeah, it's like, I wonder how you could do it more and do it bigger and better. It'd be like a good question for Elon Musk, because he's got some experience. He started that school for his kids and some close friends, and he's always thinking. But orphanages are tough because it's one thing to grow up poor, it's another thing to grow up an orphan. It's like just poor plus difficult. And you need those positive role models. You need to see that there's a better option out there. To, like, we're little AI algorithms. We mimic the behaviors we see and we learn. And so we need to get them processing good data so they have the best chance of success.
Yeah, and I think that's a very vital point what you just mentioned, that we mimic what we end up seeing. And that is also something that we've noticed in the orphanages, because there was a big difference between these orphanages. We visited orphanages where all the kids, unfortunately, had HIV. So, talking about a bad situation, right? You're an orphan, and on top of that, you have HIV as well. These were the most positive kids that I've ever seen, but it's mainly by the leadership within that orphanage. They were very positive, they're very encouraging, you name it. But of course, there were also some orphanages where, the leadership wasn't as prevalent as in other orphanages. So, these kids were, kind of on themselves, just hanging out. And you notice that as well in terms of their behavior. So even there's the big differences between what these situations are like. They could both be in an orphanage, but whether you're in orphanage A or B could make a big difference.
Yeah, and I'd be willing to bet that if you went and you talked to the leaders of the child orphanage with the HIV that were leading the orphanage better, I bet you those individuals have more adversity and understand difficult things better, because I just I'm always a seeker of truth, like in the universe, as I go about my life. And what I just find that's like an inescapable truth is like this adversity creates this mental toughness, and then it gives you control over your emotions and your feelings, and you can choose to have a better life. And so, like, whenever just the other day I was doing an interview and I asked the girl, I asked her, I said, what's the most difficult thing that's ever happened to you in your life? Right. And somebody who was listening to that interview was like, I can't believe you asked her that. And I was like, well, I'm interested. Is it that your ham sandwich wasn't the way you wanted it? Is that the most difficult thing that you've experienced in life? Or have you gone through some really difficult human moments and you've got big boy pants on, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question to ask. And the other thing that I would like to mention is in terms of KidSpy, the one thing that also I found very interesting to see is that some of the people that were doing the teaching came from the orphanage that they were teaching at themselves. So that was also something that was really good to see, that they actually had, these people doing the teaching that were orphans themselves and actually used to be in that orphanage. So, talking about giving back, that is also something that I think is, something that is truly unique. It's not something you see often.
Well, the next time one of these projects comes up, whether it's the orphanage or something else that you're passionate about, just make sure to add me to your email list of people who donate, and we'll contribute and do the best that we can, here at the podcast. And I'd love to support things like that. I actually have a children's charity where we make books and give them away to homeless pregnant women facilities. So there's like specific shelters for homeless pregnant women. And so we made these children's books after my mom passed away. We took her life insurance money. She left us like $25,000 between me and my siblings. And instead of spending that on a vacation or anything, we decided to form a 501c3 nonprofit and then print like, I think we got like 10,000 of these children's books and then just gave them away.
How awesome is that? I mean, that is something, and that is, first of all, it's very admirable, because not a lot of people would do that, right? The first thing that they would think about is buying something for themselves, or, like you said, go on holiday. But the second thing is as well, you're impacting the lives of many others. And I think that is something that is truly amazing. And a lot of people don't realize, what a great feeling it is. I mean, you've probably seen the kids, walking around with those books or reading it or whatever it is, or the moms reading it to their kids. That is something that, you can't put a price to that. It's extremely valuable.
Yes, that type of experience, having children yourself, that type of experience, and then watching people that you work with professionally, like being part of their growth. Those types of intangibles, like the feelings you get from that, are far superior than like acquiring any object. They last longer, they feel different, and so it's interesting how our bodies, like what is it called, altruism, like our bodies physiologically reward us for doing good things.
Yep. I couldn't agree more, to be honest.
So tell me a little bit about VMware. I saw that, so you're like head of HCI. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, sure. For those who don't know, I think first and foremost, VMware started out as a pure virtualization company. In other words, what we allowed you to do primarily in the early days was taking, any physical machine, talking about a server or a desktop with Windows or Linux or whatever it ended up being, and creating a virtual machine out of that, which basically allowed you to run multiple virtual machines on top of a physical instance. So this resulted in, for a lot of data centers, and a lot more efficiency, especially back in the days. I'm talking about, 20 plus years ago. And for a lot of the companies, probably 15 years ago, that they started looking into virtualization. But a lot of those companies, or a lot of organizations, started running out of data center space. They had issues with cooling, they had issues with power consumption. So they started looking into, solutions where, they could potentially change the density of their data center. So that is something that VMware brought to them, and VMware was, one of the first to market, or at least the first to market, to do x86 virtualization. Of course, there were already a virtualization type of platforms out there, but then we're talking about, mainframe-alike solutions. But for x86, VMware brought a very unique solution to market, and they've been a dominant player in that space for the longest time. Now, of course, as soon as you start becoming the dominant player in that space, it means that the growth of your company will start slowing down. As soon as you capture 70% of the market, and in that 70% market or 80% market space that you own, the majority of workloads are virtualized. It basically means that the growth starts slowing down. So one of the things that VMware started looking into is, okay, what other things can we do to make life easier for data center administrators, or people managing virtual desktops or laptops, or maybe even potentially iPhones or Androids or whatever it ends up being. So what we ended up doing is creating a multitude of different types of solutions. We have solutions focusing on the end user computing space, where we can manage not only your desktop, your laptop, but also your phone, for instance, and help you deliver applications to those types of devices. But where I focus on the most is on the data center aspect of things, and HCI is one of those solutions in that particular space. Now, for those who don't know, HCI stands for Hyperconverged Infrastructure, which basically refers to the situation where we are taking compute and storage and combine that function into a single server. So normally, traditionally, you would have multiple different physical appliances or servers that would host this functionality. So you would have a storage system, and then on the other hand, you have multiple compute systems. What we did in our case is we virtualized that storage system, and we embedded that in our hypervisor, so in our virtualization layer, so that the management of those systems, the installation and the configuration becomes extremely simple. On top of that, of course, you can imagine that we also can layer additional tools on top of that particular platform to manage the environment. So look at logging, look at monitoring, but potentially also leverage the platform to deploy particular applications. That could be anything ranging from cloud native all the way to something like Oracle or SAP or whatever it ends up being.
And so I saw that you were at the company for a while prior to moving into this position. It looks like HCI is a business unit. of VMware, and you're the CTO of the HCI. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah. So just to give some background around that, we used to have a business unit called Storage and Availability, which was mainly focused on storage, which in our case is vSAN. And then availability, which is more or less Site Recovery Manager, which is our solution that allows you to replicate data between locations and recover the data if something happens in your environment. After that, what happened is we had another product somewhere else in the company, which was called VMware Cloud Foundation, which is basically a suite of different components that allows you to set up a software-defined data center, or as some people refer to it, a full-stack hyper-converged infrastructure. Leveraging that complete suite of software. So what they did is they actually merged those two teams into a new team, which was then called the HCI business unit, which then recently merged again with a different group called the Cloud Platform Business Unit. So now within the Cloud Platform Business Unit, we have the people focusing purely on things like vSphere, which is our virtualization layer, the management aspect of things, with solutions like vCenter Server, for instance. And on top of that, we also have our side of the house, which is more focused on storage and availability. In my case, my focus is purely storage and availability. So I'm primarily focusing on things like vSAN, but also things like Site Recovery Manager, virtual volumes, anything that is related to storage and availability in our business unit.
That is very cool. And so you kind of got there through like the merging of these teams. But if someone were asking like, how would they replicate it from, maybe looking for professional advice, what would you say is one of the big reasons or big learnings that you took away from going from, team leader to like a larger leadership position, like VP, CTO, director level position?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's an interesting question as well. If you look at how I started at VMware, I kind of had a crazy career, to be honest. I started out as a senior consultant as part of professional services. Before I joined VMware, I actually was a consultant working for a smaller consultancy company in the Netherlands. So I was mainly doing, 4 or 5 hosted deployments, relatively small for VMware environments. But I was also doing some blogging on the side, and people started picking up on some of my blog articles, and through my blog articles, I actually got recruited into VMware as a consultant. So I joined VMware as a consultant, but I'm as Dutch as it can get. I'm very open and I'm very honest, and I have no problem in terms of providing feedback. If something is not working the way customers would expect it to work, or I would expect it to work, the one thing that I always end up doing is I try to reach out to the developers. I will try to reach out to the product managers, and potentially, if needed, if the problem isn't getting solved the way I would think customers would expect it to be solved, I would even go one level higher. And that is something that people picked up on. Based on that, I was recruited within VMware into a different group that focused more on larger cloud deployments. So I did some of the larger cloud deployments for VMware in Europe, and I started creating all of the content around that as well. And after that, I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. A position opened up in the technical marketing team. Fortunately for me, some of the technical marketing guys had used some of my content that I wrote for my blog for some of the white papers. So I reached out to the manager and ended up moving towards technical marketing. And I think this is where it gets interesting for the majority of people, because if you look at the role I have, which is, by the way, Chief Technologist, not Chief Technology Officer, I'm part of the part of the Office of CTO, but there's a distinction here, and I'll explain in a second what the distinction is, at least from a VMware side of things. As soon as I moved towards technical marketing, one of the things that I started focusing on more and more, and I was already doing this with my blogging, but it was the social media aspect of things, the public speaking, and what have you. And I was terrified of public speaking before I actually even started doing this, right? I was, I couldn't even stand up in a meeting of about 10, 15 people and explain, which direction we should be heading towards. That was definitely not my thing. But I felt that in order to grow to the next level, in order to be promoted within the technical marketing team, even from being a technical marketing manager to being a technical marketing architect or a senior architect or principal or whatever it ended up being, I needed to make sure that I didn't only, make a name for myself within the company, right? Which you can do by, sending emails, talking to various people. But I also needed to make sure that within the community, people not only knew who I was, but also felt that I had something valuable to contribute. And that is something that I started focusing on. And that's actually where it, started, picking up significantly. I wrote a couple of books. I did a slew of presentations at various user group conferences. VMware organizes their own event, which is called Vmworld, which, where you will have 25,000 people attending. So I presented at those as well the past 12 years. And I did many podcasts and what have you. And that's more or less when my name started bubbling up more and more often. And at some point in time, I focused a lot on storage and availability during my talks. So that is something that stood out to some of our EVPs and general managers. And one of the general managers, which back in the day then was about to start the vSAN business unit, the storage and availability business unit, they were looking for someone to help them evangelize the product, basically go out to customers, the larger customers, and do the events where needed. So he reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to join his team, and that's basically how I got into that position. Now, I briefly mentioned that there's a distinct difference in terms of the role CTO and Chief Technologist, and for me specifically, and I think that goes for a lot of the people who have a Chief Technologist role within VMware. The emphasis typically tends to be more towards the customer and the events, where a lot of the people who have a CTO role within VMware primarily tend to focus on the inbound aspect of things. So they are more towards the development side of the house. So they typically will have a development background. They in a lot of cases they were either a principal engineer or they managed a larger group of developers. In the case of the majority of the chief technologists, I would say that probably 95% have some kind of field background. They have, a huge affinity with customers, and they know how to explain technology to our customers as well in the most simplest way. And I think that is something that is a distinct difference, but also really important to understand when you go through the motion of your career, right? Do you want to focus on becoming a CTO? Or, potentially you could be a chief technologist. I'm not saying that if you're a chief technologist, you can't become a CTO, because we have those as well. But in general, for a lot of these technology companies, you will see that the focus for the CTO tends to be, more towards the development side of things, where I tend to focus more on the outbound aspect. But of course, all of the feedback that I get during talking to customers is something that I will bring back to the development teams as well. So it's more a mix than it is, really inbound focused.
I love that because it's completely new. I've never heard it before, but it sounds good and it makes sense. And it's always interesting because the humans and the types of people that you need to have success. And then it's just how you go about labeling them, for the outside world. And so I like when I hear new stuff. And so next time I see that CT role, I'll be on the lookout and I won't think it's a typo.
Yeah, exactly.
CT. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course there's things as well like levels, right? So it's always a difficult discussion, because before I actually became a chief, I was the first chief technologist within VMware, and that's an interesting story also, because I was being put forward for promotion back then, and there was only one level to go to. But when the review board for promotions looked at my job profile and the work that I was doing, it didn't match that level that I was supposed to be promoted towards. So naturally they said, it's not a good fit. We don't feel that he may deserve the title, but he doesn't meet the profile that is associated with that particular title. So that's when they came up with this chief technologist role within the company. They wanted to have a role within the company that is on the same level as, something comparable within the development space, but then had a, slightly different expectation with it. So that is interesting, and it's for me it was an interesting experience, because you can imagine what happens when they phone you up. Well, you didn't get the promotion, and then 3 months later, they will tell you, oh, we're actually working on something else, which is based on what you've been doing the past 2 years. And it's interesting.
So there was a 3-month gap from the time that you found out you didn't get it until that you know that there was something else coming.
Oh yeah, it was probably even longer than that. But the thing is, keep in mind, right? VMware is a company of about 35,000 people roughly. We have a huge HR department, and whenever new roles and new responsibilities are defined, it needs to be first of all, it needs to be approved, but it needs to go through different levels, right? And depending on the level that you're at, it will go either high up or extremely high up. So you can imagine that these types of things need to go through different levels. On top of that, within most companies, certain titles are actually protected. Like within VMware, for instance, you can't simply create a job role which has the word principal in it or the word chief. And the key reason for it is fairly simple, right? From a principal engineering standpoint, that is only obtainable by people within R&D who are developers, and they've gone through the ranks, right? They start at the bottom, go all the way at the top. So there's multiple steps that they will need to take. From a chief perspective, well, they give you that particular title for a reason, because it opens up certain doors amongst different types of customers. But if you end up with 500 CTOs or 250 chief technologists, there is no value anymore. If everyone that comes in is a chief technologist or a principal engineer, the customer doesn't see the value anymore. So those are protected job roles within the company. So you can imagine that as a result, it takes time for these to be approved. And not only does the title need to be approved, but the responsibilities and the different levels within the company, whether that's director, senior director, VP, also need to be associated with it and also will need to be approved.
Yeah, I remember seeing like some smaller companies have field CTOs for every state, and I'm like, okay, who's that? They're just like the highest level technical salesperson for that state. But then I also remember a funny one was when I first got into B2B marketplace rather than just building contracts apps, which is what I had done for the first like 10 years of my career. I started looking for the correct people to reach out to with different ideas and ways to grow business and work together. And I kept seeing business development representative, BDR, like at the companies. And I was contacting these people and I'm not getting anything back from them. Now that I own a company and we have BDRs, I'm like, it's the worst name for the title. It was like everyone was calling them like salespeople. And then they started to hate that title. And so then all the companies switched the titles to be something less salesy. And it's just fascinating, the evolution of how these titles work.
Yeah, you see that in the sales space a lot, right? With the system engineers who used to be sales engineers, then they became system engineers. Now, majority of them are actually solution engineers or solution architects, because in the end, it makes sense, right? Sales engineer, you have the feeling someone will show up on my door to actually sell me something. Then system engineer, it sounds a bit more technical, so it's probably a guy explaining the technology. Solution engineer or solution architect means that he's not only looking, to create a solution for what they are doing, but he's trying to build something end to end. So they may help me solve some business problems along the way. So the evolution of those types of titles makes sense. And also the field CTO thing, I think a lot of startups started coining that title. And it's pretty straightforward, right? The majority of those people used to be technical marketing architects back in the day. And then after a while, people started using this back then new job role, which was called evangelist. And then some people after that became a chief technologist, and a lot of them actually started labeling themselves as field CTO, which typically means that they are the most senior people, a person that does something from a technical perspective and has an engagement with an X amount of customers. It's kind of a dilution of value in terms of the roles. And you see that with startups a lot, right? Everyone is a senior director or a vice president as well. And if you move from a startup to a larger company, whether that's Google or Facebook, you will see that the person that was a VP or a senior director at their startup now just becomes a manager, or the VP becomes a director instead of a senior director or even a VP, because Google or Facebook or VMware or whoever it ends up being will look at the amount of people that you're managing, the revenue stream that is coming in, and then they will figure out what the level should be, because that's what, in the end, what it's all about. What value are you creating, and what's the revenue that's coming in for the company?
I love that you say that, because that is it. Like, that is, so everything that we do, we're like, well, how is this action or this process going to bring value? And because value, revenue is just value converted, right? Like they're essentially the interchangeable. And it's just absolutely fascinating how much I've learned, growing a business. And it's almost like, it's a very difficult thing. Obviously, like Musk will, I listen to all those guys like Musk, Bezos, Branson, and they all talk about how it's the most difficult thing. And then like going out and doing it, and what it does is like it peels back and allows me to see stuff from like the highest level of perspective. And then like you're at the top. And so it's just like it's a quicker, more difficult way to get to the top, like founding a startup and having success. At least like when I'm saying top, I mean like top of an organization, to understand this. Like if you would have explained to me 10 years ago, or tried to get me to understand 10 years ago, this concept of value creation, and people pay for problems, or people pay for solutions to problems and all of these things, I just wouldn't do it. But after going through the motions, it's like, it's so obvious and right in front of us. And so I love that, that your mind is right on value creation.
Yeah, I mean, that is a key thing. And I think that's the key thing in everything you do, right? You asked the question in terms of, just a couple of minutes ago, in terms of career development and stuff like that. How do you go from senior, or from a senior consultant to chief technologist? And I think there are a couple of things that are really important. First of all, providing value. If you don't provide any value, then you're not going to get noticed in any shape or form. And then secondly, which is what I tell, I do some mentoring for people. And one of the things I always mention to people is that what's really crucial is communication, right? If you don't speak up, right? If something is not right and you don't speak up, then you're never going to stand out. And in some cases, you may find yourself in a situation, I've been there, right, where the whole company or a large portion of the company doesn't appreciate the feedback that you've provided. But in the end, if it solves the problems for customers, then at some point in time, those people will look back at it and be like, you know what, he actually had a point. He wasn't just trying to be, a nasty person. And they've used some pretty nasty names when it comes to me when providing feedback. But he was trying to solve a problem for customers, and in the end, he actually did have a point, and he did it to make sure that not only the company, but the product that those people were responsible for in the end became successful. I think those are the key things.
I love that you mentioned that, because it's like when giving feedback, there's like almost two types of responses. There's a person hating you and then going off and just continuing to hate you because they just responded to feedback. Nobody likes feedback. I mean, you could say you like feedback and train yourself to say that thing, but you still feel that human emotion inside when you're getting it. And then there's the person who, the second one would be the person who gets the feedback, doesn't like it, but then goes and changes, because like, you don't like it in the moment. Like when you're getting it, you're just like, oh, but then you go back, you think about it, in your core that you've decided you want to be better and do better. And then so you make that change.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing, right? And as I mentioned at the start, I'm as Dutch as it gets. And especially when you work for a company like VMware, and there's a huge huge diversity within the company, right? So we have people from various different countries. Of course, the majority of our engineers are actually based in Palo Alto or near Palo Alto. It doesn't mean that they are white male engineers. We have people from China, we have people from India, we have people from Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, Israel, you name it, right? There's such a huge variety of people at the company. That also means, from a cultural perspective, when it comes to providing feedback, that you need to try to take that in consideration as well. And that's probably one of my biggest mistakes in the early days. Because I came from the Netherlands. People are very open and honest. If they don't like your T-shirt, they will tell you that it's not the nicest T-shirt you could wear, for that particular occasion or whatever it is. Where in a lot of other countries, they will tell you, oh, you look nice, right? In Holland, they will say, yeah, not so much. So it's stuff. Those are things you need to get used to, and it's still problematic occasionally, because some of the feedback that you provide is not always what people would like to hear. So it's trying to find that balance in terms of how can I tell them A, what works, but B, more importantly, try to explain to them what doesn't work in hopefully a nice way, which is not always easy. It's something that is difficult, and especially in this day and age, right? Everyone has 1,000 things on their mind. So you open up the email, you open up your email client. You don't even start with "Good morning, hope all is well." You simply start typing away. You send, and then you realize, oh, I probably should have opened up differently. Good morning, right? And just try to have at least this buffer in between your name and the feedback, so that they don't instantaneously think that you're trying to call their baby ugly, because that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to solve or prevent issues from occurring, but it's that's not always easy.
No, and that's where the culture being strong in one direction or another is really useful. One example, like when I want direct interactions, my Israeli friends. So I think part of it's because every citizen has to go through the military, like in Israel. So they get that military style behavior and training. But man, I feel so comfortable. Like I feel I'm not on edge, because I know that they are saying like everything that they think, and they're being incredibly direct. And the first time, I just remember the feeling like the first time I'd met an Israeli person, and they're it was unbelievable. I just felt immediately like comfortable. I was like, these people have taken all social filters and turned them off, and they just communicate. And it's, it's its own style, it's its own culture. It's, it just is. But I found it refreshing, because I like that instant direct feedback.
Yeah, I agree. It's I wouldn't say the Dutch are as extreme as the people from Israel, but it's fairly close, to be honest. I know a couple of, I haven't been there, but I've been in the region, and I know some folks from Israel, and actually visited customers with a couple of sales engineers from Israel as well. And I know they can be very direct. I personally appreciate it, but I can also imagine that, for people with a different background, especially if you go more towards Asia, for instance, right? It can be very difficult to hear some of the feedback that could be provided. Actually, it wouldn't even be accepted, and you could find yourself at risk of being kicked out of the office. So that is the challenging thing. So that's why I always try to tell people that communication and your style of communication is really important when it comes to career progression, because it's, without being heard, you won't get anywhere.
So let's say we've got some people listening, and they're like, I want to progress in my career. I hear these two individuals talking about these concepts of providing value and communication, that they need to get better at understanding these two things. Where do you point people that you mentor? How do you tell them to get better at understanding value and get better at communication?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are a multitude of books that you could start reading. Typically, well, I do read books, but I'm not the biggest book reader. So one of the podcasts, I mean, you may have heard of the podcast, but one of the podcasts that I tend to listen to is The Art of Manliness. And The Art of Manliness, they have, an insane amount of episodes that typically discuss, anything from public speaking, just communication in general, how to work, how to work at being uncomfortable. So how to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, which has everything to do, could be part of your career as well, right? Everyone wants to progress to the next level, but in order to progress to the next level, you need to, move out of your comfort zone, which isn't always, the most pleasant space to be at. So you need to get comfortable with getting out of your comfort zone. But that is one of the things that I've been focusing on, listening to some of the podcasts, and especially The Art of Manliness. They have some really great episodes where they discuss, things like communication and stuff like that. The other thing that I would like to say, what probably helped me personally the most, is public speaking. I mentioned it at the start. I used to be terrified of public speaking. So even, at school back in the days, when I was 14, 15, I wouldn't do any presentation whatsoever. I would get physically sick. So I would call in, at 8 in the morning, tell them that I was sick, and I would actually be sick just thinking about the fact that I had to do a presentation at school. I forced myself to start doing that at smaller events and larger events. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't the smartest when I started out. So I started out with the one of the largest IT conferences that there is in this space. So I started out at Vmworld, unfortunately, which is not a smart thing to do, which I would never ever recommend anyone doing. So if you're interested in learning how to communicate, how to speak to an audience, and whether that's a small group or a larger group, public speaking is key, because the one thing that I think it taught me most is to think about what you're going to say. Think about the key points that we like to get across. And before you do, you need to get an understanding of the audience. And I think those things are key in general when it comes to communication. Because you and I can be talking, for an hour, but if I don't understand, at what level, for instance, in terms of technology you are, right? You may have heard about VMware, you may have not heard about VMware, and I can start talking about, things like transparent page sharing and our DRS scheduler and whatever it is. But if you barely know what a virtual machine is, you're not going to understand, right? So by doing public speaking, you basically it will force you to get a better understanding of the audience, and then it will force you it will force you to learn how to interact with the audience as well. You can see their responses, what to say at certain points in time, and it will allow you to learn how to make or how to figure out what is absolutely crucial in terms of the message to get across. So I think that is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, usually the way the world works is even if you want to get up and get in front of a lot of people, you can't, because you just don't have those. You had the title and you had VMware, so you had the opportunity.
It's an interesting thing because let me tell you the story. This is probably funny for the people listening. So it is probably about 11 years ago. I had just joined the company. I was still a senior consultant. And I was already doing a lot of blogging on the topic of vSphere high availability. So it's very specific for our space. I just provided one of the engineers some feedback, and that engineer was actually, he submitted a session for the conference. I didn't submit a session for the conference. He submitted the session for the conference. And after we had a couple of conversations, he reaches out to me and says, what, would you like to join me during this session? Well, I'm terrified of public speaking, so my first answer was, nah, not really. I'm not interested. I don't want to do it. I've got too much thing going on. I'm trying to find an excuse. And he was like, well, you know what? Could you help me create the deck? Because you are in touch with customers on a daily basis. I just want to make sure that my content actually reflects what these guys would like to hear. I said, you know what? Sure, I'm happy to help you with the deck. So the two of us started creating this deck. And then, after 2 months of going back and forth, having meetings, conference calls, and going over the content, he was like, you know what, the content really well. Why don't you just present half of the deck? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I don't really want to do it. But at that point in time, I realized that, like I mentioned, in order to move forward, I need to make sure I get my name out there, and I need to get comfortable with public speaking, because, at some point in time when you get to a certain level, you will need to present in front of a large group. So I said yes. But before I said yes, I asked him, I said, how many people are going to show up to this session? He said, well, on average, about 100 people. If we're very lucky, 125, 150. I'm like, oh, okay. So I immediately started to get nervous. Now, 2 weeks before the event, he drops me an email and he says, Duncan, I've got a problem. We have this release coming up after VMworld. I have 6 escalations that I need to take care of. So I need to solve these bugs. Otherwise, we can't ship the release. So, that's obviously not an option. I'm like, okay, so now what? He said, well, you need to deliver the session on your own. Okay. I said, well, you know what? It's 100 people probably. Who cares? I'll do it. So he emails the VMware team and says, you know what, I can't be part of the session any longer. Can you please register the session fully to Duncan's name? So VMware registers the session to my name, and I get an email that mentions the session is registered to your name. Here is the backend system. You can see how many people signed up. Well, you probably can already guess what happened. I click on the link. I go to the session itself and I notice that it doesn't say 100 or 125 or 150, but it actually says 730 people. So they bumped us up to like 4 times to the biggest room that they had available within the Moscone Conference Center in San Francisco. Not only did I have the session once, but they scheduled the session twice because there were so many people that wanted to see the session. As you can imagine, when you need to go up in front of 700 plus people, you know, a room which is literally, you know, hundreds of meters deep, you know, probably 100-meter wide, it's just, it's terrifying. It's terrible. And like I said, that's why I would never ever recommend anyone to start out with a large conference, because it just, you know, it wipes you out. I was drained for the rest of the day when I delivered that session. I can tell you that. I was sweating. You know, I couldn't eat. I couldn't drink. I felt sick. It was horrible. But you know, in the end, although it wasn't my best session ever, it was, you know, probably the worst session I ever done, and I knew it was. I realized that as well, that it wasn't good, but I knew, you know, I did it, and it can't get worse than this. So I just need to make sure I get more practice. I do it more often, and probably the next time, hopefully, it's going to be a smaller session, which of course at VMworld will never happen, but at some of the user conferences, it will happen. So, you know, I made sure to just do it more and more often to ensure that, you know, at least at this point in time, I could do a decent job at it, because it's not a great feeling when you get off stage in front of 700 people and you know that it wasn't what you would hope, you know, what you would hope for. But
when you crush it, when you get off stage after you crushed it, that is an unbelievable feeling.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely happens, of course, but definitely usually not the first time. That typically happens when you've done it a bunch of times.
Yeah, for me, it was like, you know, standing up in front of, you know, a team or just a small group of people, and then, you know, giving my first presentation. I think there's probably like 10 people in the room, and then did another one, 10 or 15, and then did another one at like 30 people, 35, and then, you know, 50, and then 100. And then I, you know, did that for a couple months, speaking to rooms of 100, and then it went 500, 1,000, 5,000. And then I noticed that there wasn't really much of a difference between like 1,000 and 5,000, because you can only, the room can only feel so big. There can only be so much energy. I think like if you go to like 25,000, it would be different if you were like in a stadium, right? But as long as you're in the rooms where they're just like pulling down those walls and expanding it deeper and wider, you kind of get that like front stage. You get the feeling of the room, and I don't know, it's fantastic.
But that also very much depends on how often you've done it. So the one thing that I've noticed the very first time that I did my session at VMworld, which was the one that I was just talking about, is because I was so nervous, I got really hypersensitive. So, you know, if someone would drop his pen all the way at the end of the room, I could hear it. I noticed, you know, every single thing in the room, but it was mainly because I was so freaking nervous. These days, you know, if someone's phone will ring, you know, I will probably make a joke and continue with the conversation, right? It's not a problem anymore. But especially in, you know, when you get started with these types of things, you tend to get hypersensitive. The thing that I've probably learned most is that the most common mistake that people make is when they start presenting, and especially when they have a slide deck and they've rehearsed it many, many times, they are so focused on the content. They're so focused on delivering every single bullet point that's on the slide. And then when they forget a slide, they tend to get extremely nervous. Or they forget, you know, a bullet point, they tend to get extremely nervous. What a lot of people don't realize is that no one in the audience knows what your talking track is for the slide, right? It's just that the slide is there to support your story. So make sure that it doesn't contain an insane amount of detail, right? A picture, a couple of words, that usually works really well, something that supports your story. But more importantly, if you forget to say something, don't get nervous, because you can repeat it. You can say it the next slide, or 5 slides down the line. You can take a step back and come back again, right? It doesn't really matter. People don't know what you're going to say. And the other thing that I think is really important, something that I didn't realize, is that especially with these, you know, technology conferences, every single person in the room is there to learn something. So if you're speaking, you don't need to get nervous that someone's going to be heckling you, or, you know, they are looking for you to fail. They are spending, you know, their time during a conference to learn something. They're not going to sit there for an hour waiting for you to fail. that had to learn something. So you probably have something valuable to mention. Otherwise, they wouldn't have picked a session. So don't get
they
nervous.
want it to be good. Yeah,
Exactly.
they are on your side for sure.
For sure. But it's easy to forget, right? When you have 700 people staring at you or 50 people, whatever it ends up being, the first few times you will forget about that. But it's definitely something you need to ingrain, in your memory, because it's important. It will help you deliver the story.
No, I like what you said too about keeping it simple with the slides. When I'm doing a talk, what I'll do is I'll say, in 1 week, what's the 1 or 2 things the person's going to remember from this talk, like in a week in the future? And then I try to gear everything around supporting that, and just to make sure that those are the core points. One time I did this. I was doing a tour last year. I did like 50 talks, and I had 2 different talks that I was giving. And, they print the talk information in the programs, right? And so I get to this one, I think it was in Chicago, like 500 people or something. But I had the wrong deck was loaded for the one that they were going to give me. And they were very specific about this, but I knew the talk well enough to where I just left everything on the first screen, which was just like a branding screen. And I just gave the talk without the slides, because when I very first started giving talks, I did it without slides. I was just telling a story. And then people requested slides so much that I ended up making slides for my story. And then when I didn't have the slides once, I was like, oh, this is fine. And honestly, like, nobody even noticed that I didn't use the slides, because if you just talk to them and you tell them a story and they're interested in the content of that story, they're just going to sit there and listen to you.
Yeah, and of course, that also very much depends on the content that you're delivering. For me, a lot of the content is extremely, well, I probably shouldn't say extremely technical, but we do deep dives. We do, just average level, technology type of session. So depending on the content that you're delivering, you will need to have some slides supporting you. The other thing which I also always really enjoy is doing some form of demo, because we have a multitude of products, and a lot of people haven't seen the product, or they're not really sure what it looks like. So I always like to do the demos. And the one thing that I think is always, it's probably the hardest thing to do for the majority of people, but I can play a demo behind me without seeing what is happening on the screen and actually talk to the demo, right? I don't know what it is, but for some other reason, I'm pretty good at remembering the flow of these types of demos. So I can literally talk through them without watching the screen, and that is also something that a lot of people tend to appreciate, right? It's although it's just a video, and it's just a way of delivering those types of things, which is it makes you seem very comfortable up on stage. Even if you're not, it makes you seem very comfortable.
Yeah, and the more time you spend on stage, the more comfortable you get too. Now, we were talking about like mimicking earlier the behaviors. Do you have any speakers that you personally like that I could maybe post some links in our show notes? People could see. We'll find some of your talks. We'll post them in there.
Sure.
But any other speakers you're a fan of?
Well, I think when I started out in my career, there was one guy who's doing a lot of sessions from a virtualization VMware perspective, which was Chad Sakich. He's just a natural when it comes to public speaking, right? You have people that, like myself and some of my other colleagues, we really had to learn, to get comfortable up on stage and tell a story. This guy, it doesn't matter what he's talking about, he will get up and he will crush it, right? It's like this little energizing bunny. It's just, he's so energetic, he knows how to talk to the crowd, and it's very entertaining. The other one, there are 2 people within VMware which I also think deliver excellent content. I mean, first of all, our CEO Pat Gelsinger. He had some, really good, stories in general to share about what customers are doing, and what kind of technologies we have, and what they are seeing out there. One of the other people that I've seen presenting many different times is Joe Bagley. Joe is the CTO for EMEA specifically in VMware, and he is the CTO for VMware as a company. So he represents all different types of technologies. And what I always find very interesting in his talks is that he mixes various things, whether it's consumer technology, what's happening in the consumer space, how that may reflect on the enterprise space, and then he mixes it, with all various things of life and the interesting stories that he's heard from customers, interesting stories that he's heard from his kids, and what have you. And somehow he always ties it back to what we are doing and how VMware can make life, basically for everyone easier. It's very interesting, his conversations.
Yeah, I have one to recommend for you that you might like. Dave Itzbitsky. He's the chief evangelist for Amazon Alexa. Yeah, he's like, I don't know, I'm just a fan of, I think he sounds a lot like the last guy you mentioned, Joe Bagley, I think that's his name. But yeah, the way he tells the stories and weaves them in and has the energy, just an all around, just when you speak and then you start to gain skill at it and learn all the little tricks and all the things that make up a good talk, and then you see people execute it differently, you start to gain this like spectator view. Yeah, he's just one of the people I've come across that I think is pretty great. I also have this book. It's down here. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. I'll grab it. It's called Storynomics.
Oh, cool.
So this guy's name is Robert McKee, and he is like a part of basically every like major movie or TV show. His list is ridiculous if you go to his website. But this is a book that he wrote on storytelling, like the storytelling with like a B2B type world / public talks. It's got the principles of great stories. It's like a low level principles of great stories. And I found that to be extraordinarily useful as like an improvement to public speaking. Now, I'm curious, you mentioned earlier, and do you have like about 10 more minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Over a little bit?
No problem.
If you don't, we can wrap up.
No worries.
Okay. So I have like two more things I want to get to. So the first one is, we were talking earlier about getting out of your comfort zone. I'm just curious, like, how are you getting out of your comfort zone today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, not too long ago, you may have read it on my blog as well. Within VMware, when you've been with the company for 5 years, we have the ability to go on what they call a take 3, and basically allows you to spend 3 months within a year, 3 consecutive months, working on something completely different than your day-to-day job. So I've been with the company for 12 years, so I already had the option 5 years ago, but I never really took it on because I was doing different things back then. I was extremely busy with moving from one team to the other team, building products and what have you. But now it was the time. I had been focusing on the same thing for the past 6 years. So I've been part of this business unit for the past 6 years, which means I've been telling a similar story for the past 6 years as well. So I started to notice that I was getting extremely comfortable, not only in my job, but you also notice that from a personal growth perspective, it kind of stops. So that's why I mentioned you need to get uncomfortable. You need to make sure that you get out of your comfort zone. And Take 3 within VMware allows you to do that. So I decided to take a Take 3 opportunity within VMware with our virtual reality / augmented reality team. And the interesting thing for me was that, first of all, I didn't know anything about AR and VR whatsoever. I knew they were planning on, at least they told me that they were looking for someone to build some kind of reference architecture around remote rendering. And remote rendering is where the content that is being presented or being shown within your augmented reality or virtual reality device is being rendered on a physical server somewhere else. So it's not a system sitting next to you, or it's not an application running within an application running within the headset that is doing the rendering. The rendering actually happens somewhere in a remote data center. So they asked me if I was interested in focusing on that project. And that took me completely out of my comfort zone, because besides getting to learn about AR and VR, I needed to understand the use cases that customers had. I needed to get familiar with remote rendering and the remote rendering solutions out there. And then I quickly found out that, that doesn't work without having some form of GPU out there to render the graphics. So I needed to understand what a GPU is and how that works. Then I need to figure out, in order to create an optimal solution, if there was a way that you could virtualize the GPU. Well, we have that technology available within VMware. And then, of course, how that actually works and how you need to set that up. And that was a pretty interesting, at least in my opinion, a pretty interesting project to go through.
What did you get to build something like specific for like a specific application?
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. We actually ended up building a reference architecture that allows us or allowed us to remote render extremely graphic intense application to an Oculus Quest. So the Oculus Quest is one of the cheapest headsets out there. You can buy it for $400, and it's not really suitable for high-end graphics, mainly because it has a low-spec CPU and a low-spec GPU within the headset, and typically don't connect it to a physical machine. So in our case, what we ended up doing is we used a remote rendering protocol, and we used GPU technology to render the graphics on a physical server, and we streamed that over Wi-Fi to the headset itself. So that was the solution that we ended up building, and it is the solution that a bunch of customers are interested in. And the reason, it's stuff that you find out right when you go through this exercise. The reason that they are interested in it is because of the fact that this allows them to not only use cheap devices, but on top of that, all of their intellectual property or data isn't stored on the device. It's simply streamed as a graphic image to the device itself. So if one of the devices gets lost or is stolen, the IP doesn't disappear, because as soon as the thing is switched off, that data is gone. The data only exists within the data center. It's the image that is being streamed. So it's not the fact that they can use cheap devices, it's the fact that they actually have a secure solution which is managed by the data center team and can be monitored as well by the data center team. That was really important for these types of customers. So that was a very interesting exercise. And like I said, for me especially, because I didn't know anything about these types of technologies, it was very interesting.
Check this out. Let me see if I can share this here. We were looking today for like different companies to have on the podcast. It's like part of our routine. This company makes AR for firefighters to like see through when there's smoke. And doesn't that just look like the future?
Yeah, that's insane. And the other thing is as well, we had a discussion with a couple of firefighters on this topic, not about AR, but about virtual reality specifically. And so what they do to train these guys and girls typically is they have a container, and they set up a room in a container, and they burn the container down, and then they have these teams going in to try to figure out where the fire started in order to learn how to investigate arsony and stuff like that, right? But the problem with that is that if they want to train multiple teams per day, so let's say they train 6 teams per day, right? They're not going to burn down 6 containers because that's too expensive. So what they do is all 6 teams will go into the same container. But the first 5 teams can't touch any of the objects because that contaminates the crime scene. So it's not really a great way of training them. So what they ended up doing from a virtual reality perspective is they simply burn down a couple of containers. They 3D scan the whole environment, picking up objects, putting it back, picking up object, putting it back. And then they've rendered that whole scene. And now they simply give these firefighters a headset, and they can go in virtual reality and do the full training, right? And every single person can do the training as if they are the first to enter, and they can touch anything they want. They can pick it up, they can put it back, right? And when the next person does the training, they simply reset the scene, and voila, they can go ahead and do it. It's those types of use cases were very interesting to hear. It's the stuff you don't think about, right?
I love it. I'm also excited about, I saw in the news that you guys or VMware did a deal with Space Force, right? Like I thought that was very cool because I'm just a huge fan of space. I'm a fan of all the amazing business opportunities that will happen in space. Like space mining asteroids. And I see your
Yeah.
like TIE fighter type things back there too, in your background. Are you excited about, well, first of all, did you get to be involved with any of the Space Force projects?
No, so the problem with these types of projects is that I've been involved with, I'll mention one later, been involved with some interesting projects, but of course these types of projects, and especially when it comes to Space Force, it's a very select group of people that get involved with these types of deals and these types of conversations, and mainly because a lot of the things that are being discussed are highly classified, so it requires you to be at a specific security level. And as a Dutch person, it's almost impossible to get, it's not almost impossible, it's impossible to get at that security level because they expect you to be a US citizen. So that is challenging. But if you look in Europe, I've had some really interesting conversations with people, with various people, right? People that were creating, for instance, submarine technology, the data center technology for submarines. I've had conversations with customers that build airplanes that do anything from a military point of view, whether that's deploying units in the Middle East or whatever it ends up being. But it's we have some really interesting conversation, and we have a lot of interesting customers, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, right? When you talk about technology companies, I'm pretty sure your listeners will have the same thing. I've seen a list of people you've interviewed. I've listened to a lot of the interviews. When people think about technology companies, you will ask them, name 5 technology companies, right? They will tell you, probably Google, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, Uber. It's those types of companies, which aren't all necessarily 100% technology companies, probably 99%, right? Because without the technology, they wouldn't be where they are today. What a lot of people don't realize is that if you look at the majority of companies out there, like look at the Fortune 500, majority of them, and probably an extremely high percentage, I don't know the exact percentage from the top of my head, but I can guarantee you they are running some kind of VMware technology underneath, whether that's in the data center or for managing, any of their end user devices, or it's something around monitoring or automation, whatever it is. A lot of them are actually using our technology, and that's the interesting thing about a company like VMware. You're in touch with so many different organizations and companies out there. You have conversations, one day about a grocery store, the next day you're talking about a submarine, or someone trying to do a data center on a train, or whatever it ends up being.
That is super exciting. Yeah, I had talked to some people off the podcast about what they were doing with cruise ships and software, because they have that unique aspect that they're like off the grid essentially, and components failing between port visits and all of this interesting technology. But as we start to wrap up here, I know that there's VMworld 2020. Are you speaking there?
Yeah, I actually have 2 sessions at VMworld 2020. So one of my sessions is very specific. So for those who are into VMware technology, I have a session which is HCI 1814. I'm presenting together with my colleague Cormac Hogan on the topic of vSAN, platform for virtual machines and containerized workloads. So we'll be discussing how vSAN can help running those types of workloads. And then the other session that I have, which is ETPD 1043, is a session about the take 3 that I was just talking about. So my journey around being, uncomfortable and getting out of my comfort zone, and what I did during those 3 months specifically. So I'll be discussing some of the findings around virtual reality, augmented reality, some of the use cases, some of the interesting things that I encountered when I went through the project itself. So I have 2 sessions at the event.
Excellent. We'll post links in the show notes for people to register for the event and find out more there. This is awesome. We did it. We made a podcast. How do you feel?
I feel awesome. That was a really good conversation. I didn't know what to expect, so it went really well. Thanks.
Yeah, I just figured we'd make it a format to where I enjoy doing it. We just kind of hang out and talk.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of the podcasts that I've been part of, they typically tend to deep dive into specific technologies, which sometimes is interesting, but it can also be really dry. So, I prefer to have these types of conversations personally.
Yeah, well, there's so many like I've been an engineer for 17 years, software engineer, and but my focus was mainly in business logic for web-based applications, right? So helping businesses do business things on the web, and so that leaves me out of like 80%, 90% of engineering because you've got just so many different facets to it. So I figured we just keep the topic something that like all technology people, all engineering benefit from and find use with.
It's I was looking at the list of people that you had on, and I noticed that Kit Colbert was on as well. So he's one of the CTOs within VMware. So I reached out to Kit. I said, "What was the conversation like?" "Oh, it was really good conversation. It's just chit chatting around." And I was looking at I'd already listened to a few of them, but I hadn't listened to all of them, and then was going through the names of all of the companies. It's ridiculous, man. It's
Well, wait, how many episodes did you listen to?
yeah, probably I don't know, 20, something like that.
Whoa, that's great. Give me some feedback.
No, like I said, I was surprised about the names of the companies that you have, that you've and people that you've interviewed so far. It's I haven't seen it anywhere else, to be honest.
This is the best part of my life. Like I loved the software engineering I did for almost 2 decades, but getting the amount of mail I get from people, like LinkedIn mail or email saying, "Hey, I heard this advice or insight and I executed on it and I actually got a promotion," or "This helped me this way or that way." Like for me, that's just the most motivating thing in the world. And it's like, all right, let's keep bringing on great people, finding out, what experience they have, and DNA, what does it do? It passes information down to the next generation. It's like at our core, that's what we do as humans. And so I figured this is a worthy pursuit. So yeah, so thank you for the feedback.
So you're now just waiting to be picked up by Spotify like Joe Rogan.
Oh no. I mean, we're definitely not Joe Rogan level.
Well, no one is.
Joe Rogan's Joe Rogan level. Yeah, but we can take the principles though of the things that we like and apply them. And so I think Joe Rogan's a good inspiration. And
well, your conversation, I wouldn't say it's similar, but it's it kind of feels similar. I'm not saying that you copied the style, but like the conversation wise, it's just a conversation. That's why I like. I listen to Joe Rogan as well. That's why I like listening to his podcast. Not everyone, not every single podcast, but the majority of them, because it's just a conversation, right? It's just people chatting away, and whatever comes up comes up. It's not, here's 20 questions that I'm going to ask, and we'll just go through them within 15 minutes, and then there we go. We go to the next episode. That's why I think people enjoy it.
Yeah, and so like I had never listened to a podcast before I started the podcast.
Oh, really?
So that's I was actually, we were like emailing this out as like MP3s, and people are like, make a podcast, right? So you can't do a newsletter with MP3s. You have to do a podcast. but what happened was I just did it the way I have conversations with my tech counterparts. And then it was like 50 or 60 episodes into the show where somebody invited me on their podcast. And when we joined the call, Duncan, like the guy, read a script about like my past in front of me, built it all up, and then asked me like a really tough question as like the introduction. Yeah. I was like, you can't do that.
I've been there, and you can notice it as well when you listen to the podcast. And the thing is, I asked on Twitter 2 days ago, because I was running out of 3 days ago, I was running out of podcast content to listen to. And I asked a couple of people, do you have a couple of tips? So there's a whole bunch of tips that pop up. But I can typically, within the first 3 minutes of listening to a podcast, I know if it's something that I will, be following or not. Because whenever that happens, it's very sterile, and they ask the tough question at the start, or you can hear that they're reading up the questions. I'm like, nope, swipe, it's gone. It's it needs to be more like you do, like more conversational, because otherwise it's not going to be interesting to listen to.
Absolutely.
And especially not when you work with a broader audience like yourself, right? I was looking at the stats with over 80,000 people. It's not going to be all, people who are focused on VMware technology. It's not going to be all people who just do something with Google. It's going to be, a wide range of people that have some form of technical interest. So.
Yeah. And then people who have technical interest, they're not like VMware people are not only interested in VMware
No,
in
yeah,
life.
exactly.
Like they're interested
Yeah.
in all sorts of, autonomous vehicles, different things happening in biology. It's
For sure.
basically just this, geek night out things. And it's not always easy either. Like there's been, a significant evolution of the podcast listening back from the earlier ones, but I really appreciate the feedback, and I'm definitely putting you on the list to come back next year.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Just reach out to me. Typically I usually have meetings in the evening, but it's easy to find an hour or two somewhere at some point in time. So no problem at all. Pleasure to be here.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic day, Duncan.
No problem.
See ya.
You too. Thanks for your time.